is Rachel Becknell. I am Vice President of the Process Technician Professionals Group, or PTP for short. I am also the project lead who was instrumental in assembling this recommendation report. As a follow-up to Mr. Joshua Garino's comments concerning the initial concerns of non-compliance of certain eye wash stations on the plant site with a national eye wash standard adopted by the state plumbing code, I would like to address both the methods employed in our study of the problem and the results of the application of such methods. Should you have any questions during my presentation, please do not hesitate to ask them. First, let me discuss the methods. The PTP group's goal with outlining the methods was to answer the question, what did the PTP group do to understand the problem? Our major emphasis in the method was to implement certain steps to determine the source of the water supply for each of the eye wash stations located on a plant-wide basis. 4 tasks were undertaken to obtain the needed information. Under Task 1, the plant was divided into 4 sectors, and a PTP group process technician was assigned in each sector to locate and identify by a location description each eye wash station with his or her assigned sector. Under Task 2, we developed an initial assessment to quickly determine which eye wash station were connected to potable water and which were likely not connected to potable water. The PTP group determined that the plant's potable water system is concerned a public water system, and all public water systems are required to maintain a minimum chlorine residual within its distribution system. The PTP group also came to realize that the plant's non-potable industrial water supply is demineralized and does not contain a chlorine residual. Therefore, we requested plant utility staff to accompany us to each eye wash station plant-wide as we flushed the eye wash station, collect a water sample, and had them run a field test for chlorine residual. If a chlorine residual was found at the eye wash station, then this station was known to be connected to the potable water. However, if no chlorine was found in an eye wash station, this eye wash station was placed on a preliminary list of crushable eye wash stations, needing further steps to be taken within to confirm that it is not connected to the potable water supply. Under Task 3, using the preliminary list of eye wash stations which did not determine to be connected to the potable water supply, that plant utility staff and a process technician of the PTP group physically trace back to the water supply, pipe back to its connection to a potable water supply main or to a non-potable industrial process water main. When it is readily found that a particular eye wash station was connected to a non-potable industrial process water main, then this eye wash station was placed on a final list of stations requiring it to be replumbed to a potable water supply. However, certain physical trace backs were impossible to perform when the supply piping went below ground or was otherwise inaccessible to view. In this case, samples of the water from this eye wash station were collected, and the plant utility laboratory ran a chemical analysis of these samples. The chemical constituents of this water samples from each of the eye wash stations in questions were compared to the chemical constituents of water from a known potable water supply main and to the chemical constituents of water from a known non-potable industrial water supply main. Using such comparison, the plant utility staff were able to confirm the source of water supply for any eye wash station which had been placed on the preliminary list of crushable eye wash stations under Task 3. Under Task 4, we added the number of physical traceback eye wash stations found not to be connected to the potable water supply to the number of eye wash stations found by chemical analysis to also not be connected to the potable water supply. The sum of both resulted in a grand total of the number of eye wash stations which were not connected to the potable water supply system on a plant-wide basis. Mr. Dillon here said, this concludes that the PTP group did not determine the number of eye wash stations which were not connected to the potable water supply. Mr. Delahousie, if you have the time, I now would like to go over the results. The purpose of the results is to answer the question, what did the PTP group determine? These results respond to each of the 4 tests I discussed under the methods that the PTP group employed. Under test 1, it was determined that there are a total of 30 eye wash stations on the plant site. Under test 2, it was determined that 22 eye wash stations did not contain a chlorine residual. Therefore, 22 eye wash stations were determined to be connected to the potable water supply. No chlorine residual was found in 8 eye wash stations, and these 8 stations were placed onto a preliminary list of crushable eye wash stations that needed further follow-up to determine whether or not they were or were not connected to the potable water supply. Under test 3, using the physical traceback method, it was determined that 3 eye wash stations were connected to the non-potable industrial process water supply. 5 eye wash stations on the preliminary list under test 2 could not be physically traced back. Water samples were collected from these 5 eye wash stations, and plant utilities confirmed that all of these eye wash stations were likewise connected to the non-potable industrial water supply. Under test 4, 3 stations were found by physical traceback to be connected to the non-potable industrial water supply. Were then added to the 5 eye wash stations which could not be physically traced back, but were confirmed by the plant utilities to be connected to the non-potable industrial water supply. By addition, it was confirmed that a total of 8 eye wash stations were not connected to the potable water supply on a plant-wide basis. Mr. Delahousie, thank you for your attention to my presentation concerning the PTP group's methods results as a part of this recommendation report. Mr. Marquis Robinson will follow me with the PTP group's conclusions and recommendations.